The news did not arrive with flashing headlines or public statements. It came quietly, like a crack spreading through ice that had held for decades. Jane Kilcher, long seen as a symbol of resilience in the brutal beauty of Alaska, finally confirmed a truth she had carried in silence, one that reshaped everything viewers thought they knew about her strength. For years, she stood against storms, predators, and isolation, her image framed as unbreakable. But beneath the frozen landscapes and steady hands was a woman slowly unraveling under invisible weight. This was not just a personal revelation. It was the collapse of a carefully built myth. Cameras had captured her survival, but never her surrender. What happens when the person everyone believes is strongest finally admits how close they came to breaking? What truth was so heavy it demanded years of silence before being spoken aloud? In that moment of confirmation, Alaska felt colder, and the silence louder, as a private pain stepped into the light, forcing the world to confront the cost of survival and the price of pretending everything is fine. The first snow of the season had begun to fall over the Alaskan wilderness, settling like a soft, indifferent shroud over the land Jane Kilcher called home. The trees bowed under the weight of frost, and the wind whispered through the skeletal branches, carrying with it the raw, untouched cold of a place that asked nothing but survival. From the outside, it was the kind of world that seemed eternal, stoic, and unbreakable. Jane had always appeared to be just as unyielding, calm, composed, capable. She had become the emblem of resilience, the quiet force viewers admired week after week on Alaska, the last frontier. Yet beneath the cameras, beneath the applause, a silent fracture had been widening, and now, after years of careful concealment, the truth pressed against her like the ice beneath her feet, fragile and inevitable. Her confirmation came in a voice that was steady, almost rehearsed, yet it carried the weight of decades of unseen struggle. Words she had locked away for fear of judgment, fear of shattering the image everyone else needed her to be, finally spilled into the light. She spoke of exhaustion that no season, no frontier, no skill could mend. Of nights spent listening to the wind, imagining it might carry a voice, any voice, that understood the loneliness she had learned to hide. In the quiet of her cabin, the wood stove crackling and throwing shadows across her lined face, Jane's eyes betrayed a story the cameras never captured. A story of vulnerability, so profound it threatened the very identity she had spent a lifetime crafting. Outside, the forest stretched endless, a frozen mirror of her own internal landscape. Isolation had been her teacher, shaping her strength, yet it had also become her jailer. Every decision, every public smile, every act of competence had been both a survival tactic and a performance, a balancing act on the knife edge of expectation. The psychological toll had accumulated silently, layer upon layer, like snowdrifts burying the land over which she walked. Every step forward was weighted with the fear of exposure, of finally being seen not as the steadfast matriarch, but as a woman simply human, fragile, afraid, aching. Yet the truth was no longer negotiable. The moment she confirmed it, the silence that had defined her life began to crack. It was the opening of a wound far deeper than any cold, any storm, any hardship of the Alaskan wild. The cameras captured her hands resting on the table, still and controlled, but the narrative they had been telling for years, the story of unshakable strength, was finally confronted by the human reality beneath. It was a confession not only to the audience, but to herself, that strength without acknowledgement of fear, without the space to falter, was a cage disguised as freedom. And as the wind whistled through the cabin, tugging at the edges of the old wooden shutters, Jane understood the unspoken question that now hung in the air. If survival alone could no longer sustain her, what would it take to find a life worth living? The silence outside mirrored the silence inside, vast and infinite, leaving only one certainty. The journey of confronting the truth had just begun. Long before the cameras followed her every move, long before the Kilcher name became a symbol of rugged resilience, Jane's childhood was a crucible forged in the relentless Alaskan wilderness. The forest and tundra were her earliest teachers, and they demanded more than obedience. They demanded endurance, instinct, and the quiet suppression of fear. The wind could tear through a thin wall of wood in minutes. Snow could rise to the height of a child's head in a single night, and danger was not a story to be told. It was a lesson to be survived. Jane's early life was a series of invisible tests, each one shaping her, each one leaving a mark that would never fully fade. Her parents, themselves products of hardship, offered lessons in survival that were practical but unyielding. Love was measured in deeds, not words. A scraped knee was to be bandaged and forgotten. Hunger was to be endured, whether to be respected. In this environment, vulnerability was a luxury no one could afford, and Jane learned quickly that the act of showing weakness invited consequence. She grew strong in body, sharp in mind, yet fragile in spirit, an internal contradiction that would shadow her for decades. Her emotions, when they surfaced, were silent, tucked away like seeds beneath the snow, invisible but alive, waiting for warmth that rarely came. The Alaskan wilderness was not merely a backdrop. It was a character in her story. Its endless horizons mirrored the isolation of her mind, its harsh winters echoing the cold reserve she learned to maintain. Nights were long, and in the absence of other voices, Jane's imagination filled the darkness with echoes of fear, whispers of doubt, and fleeting dreams of escape. She walked through frozen rivers, climbed over snowdrifts taller than herself, and learned that every misstep could have consequences she could not reverse. This endurance became her identity, inseparable from her very sense of self, and it would remain her shield and later her burden. Even as a child, there were glimpses of the cost. Moments when she lingered at the edge of tears, listening to the wind howl through the pines, feeling utterly unseen. The survival lessons she cherished were inseparable from the isolation they demanded. Her resilience was admired but built on a foundation of hidden loneliness and unspoken longing. These early experiences foreshadowed the adult Jane who would thrive in the public eye, yet struggle in private, a woman for whom strength and fear existed side by side, inseparable and unresolved. And in the quiet moments of reflection, as the northern lights danced above snow-laden hills, Jane began to understand a painful truth. The very traits that allowed her to survive the wilderness might one day become the barriers that kept her from living fully. The seeds of a lifelong internal struggle were sown here, in the frost, in the isolation, in the silence of her earliest years, an inheritance as invisible as it was inescapable. As cameras rolled and the world tuned in, Jane Kilcher stepped into a new wilderness, one made not of snow or forest, but of expectation. Alaska, the last frontier, had transformed her life into both spectacle and statement, a lens through which millions watched survival unfold with a combination of awe and intimacy. Yet beneath the carefully framed shots of chopping wood, repairing cabins, and navigating frozen landscapes, another narrative quietly unfolded. The story of a woman whose strength was increasingly demanded, scrutinized, and commodified. Her survival, once instinctive, now had an audience that judged its every expression, every stumble, every silent moment. The public saw a woman thriving against the elements, a matriarch guiding her family with calm authority, but Jane felt the pressure of a persona she could not abandon. Each season required more stamina, more precision, more unflinching capability. When the cameras were on, exhaustion had to be masked, frustration tamed, and fear tucked deep into the folds of her expression. Yet when the lenses cut, the isolation returned, sharper than ever, reminding her that the admiration she received was contingent on a performance. She had become both heroine and actor in a drama she had not fully scripted, her real self hidden behind layers of expectation and duty. Psychologically, the tension was suffocating. Jane's internal monologue was filled with contradictions. Pride in her family's accomplishments, anxiety over appearing weak, guilt for the moments when the strain of survival became unbearable. Nights were restless, the crackling of the fire echoing the turmoil in her mind. She recalled memories of childhood winters, how she had learned to suppress fear, and realized the lessons of endurance had evolved into chains, binding her to an image she could no longer fully reconcile with who she felt herself to be. Every smile to the camera, every nod of competence, became a negotiation with her own humanity, a fragile attempt to convince the world she was unbreakable while secretly questioning if she could bear the weight much longer. Small moments revealed the strain. A glance of exhaustion that lingered too long, a hesitation when handling equipment, a quiet sigh as the wind tore through the trees. These subtle fractures went unnoticed by most viewers but were magnified within her own awareness. Each day, the public's gaze acted like the relentless Alaskan wind, eroding confidence and amplifying isolation. The very landscape that had once given her solace now mirrored the audience's gaze. Beautiful, unyielding, and unforgiving. And yet, in these seasons of visibility, foreshadowing of deeper conflict emerged. The audience applauded strength, but it was the hidden cracks, the subtle tremors beneath her calm, that whispered a warning. Jane knew, somewhere deep in her bones, that survival on display would exact a cost, a reckoning she could not yet fully articulate. The line between thriving and breaking had grown perilously thin, and the next step could no longer be measured by skill or endurance alone. The wind rose outside the cabin, rattling the shutters like a persistent reminder. Jane stood silently, hands pressed to the rough wood of the counter, eyes tracing the horizon. She knew that the audience's applause could not fill the void she carried, and that the truth she had avoided for years was beginning to demand acknowledgement. The performance, no matter how flawless, could not survive forever without fracture. And in that frozen silence, she sensed the approach of a storm far more personal and inevitable than any Alaska winter. By the height of her visibility, Jane Kilcher's world had become a gilded cage, forged from admiration, expectation, and the myth of unshakable resilience. Every task she performed on camera, every word she uttered in interviews, reinforced the persona that others had come to depend upon. Strong, steadfast, unbreakable. But behind the lens, the very traits that had once been her survival tools had calcified into constraints, trapping her in a life where vulnerability was both dangerous and forbidden. Strength, once liberating, had become a prison. The psychological pressure was relentless. Each day began with the ritual of masking fatigue and fear. Her hands, calloused and steady in front of the cameras, occasionally trembled in private. Nights were spent in quiet reflection, or in restless wandering through the shadowed rooms of her cabin, listening to the wind whine like a distant voice questioning her resolve. The very wilderness that had taught her to endure now mirrored the emptiness inside her. The isolation she had once embraced as freedom now echoed with loneliness so profound that it felt physical, pressing against her chest, tightening with every heartbeat. The emotional toll manifested in subtle, insidious ways. Jane felt the weight of her family's reliance on her image, the unspoken expectation that she remain the anchor. Her children looked to her with trust and admiration, unaware of the silent strain she bore. The cameras recorded every act of competence, every brave choice, every steadfast smile, but none of them captured the nights when she questioned her own capacity to continue, when fear seeped into the marrow of her bones, unbidden and relentless. She was haunted by memories of her formative years, the long winters, the harsh lessons of self-reliance. And now those lessons had become bars, confining her within a persona she could neither abandon nor fully inhabit. Moments of quiet despair began to punctuate the long days of filming. A pause too long while chopping wood, a hesitant glance at a storm gathering over the mountains, a tremor in her voice as she issued instructions to family members. Each one a crack in the facade carefully maintained for viewers. Internally, she wrestled with guilt, wondering if she was failing those who counted on her, questioning if the image she had created for survival was, in fact, eroding the very life it had protected. Strength had become synonymous with performance, and the cost of maintaining that performance was her own emotional freedom. And yet, despite the weight of isolation, the psychological strain, the creeping fear, Jane knew she could not step away. Every time she tried to confront the truth, the expectations of others pressed back, reminding her that the persona she had built was essential to the survival of her family, to the continuity of the narrative the world had come to love. She felt trapped in a paradox. The stronger she appeared, the more imprisoned she became. As the wind battered the cabin walls, rattling the shutters and whistling through gaps in the logs, Jane stood in the silence of the kitchen, eyes fixed on the horizon where the mountains met the sky. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one building within her. A storm of unspoken fear, guilt, and isolation. She knew the next moment would demand a choice, one that could either shatter the persona she had maintained for decades or finally confront the cage she had constructed around herself. And in that quiet, frozen pause, the truth pressed nearer, impatient, unavoidable, waiting to be spoken. The moment had finally arrived. Jane Kilcher, standing within the warmth of her cabin while the Alaskan wind whipped outside, exhaled a truth she had carried alone for decades. It was not a confession born of defeat, nor a cry for pity. It was an act of courage, a reclamation of her own humanity after years of living inside the constraints of expectation. For so long, she had been seen as the unbreakable matriarch, the resilient icon of survival, a figure whose strength seemed infinite. But now, as the cameras quietly documented her words, the facade dissolved. She admitted exhaustion, fear, and grief. She revealed the silent struggles that had accompanied every season, every choice, every display of competence that the world had applauded without comprehension. Her voice was steady yet layered with emotion, the quiet tremor of vulnerability threading through every sentence. The firelight flickered across her lined face, casting shadows that seemed to echo the inner battles she had fought for years. Jane spoke of nights spent wrestling with isolation, of moments when the weight of her own expectations, and the expectations of millions, had threatened to crush her entirely. She reflected on the paradox of fame, to be admired for strength, yet to be invisible in moments of weakness. Every viewer had seen her survive, but no one had seen the private toll, the erosion of joy beneath relentless perseverance. The Alaskan wilderness, once her teacher and sanctuary, now mirrored the intensity of her revelation. The wind rattled the cabin windows, the snow swirled in endless white currents, and the mountains loomed like silent witnesses. The landscape that had shaped her life was indifferent to the struggles she had endured, yet it offered a kind of absolution, the reminder that survival was never enough on its own. Healing, acknowledgement, and truth were required to reclaim life beyond endurance. Jane's eyes wandered to the horizon, where light pierced the heavy sky, hinting at possibility beyond the frozen silence that had defined her existence. The chapter of Revelation was not simply about admission. It was about reclamation. Jane explored what it meant to step beyond performance, to honor vulnerability as strength, and to embrace the imperfections that made her human. She considered the future, a life where expectations would not dictate her emotional reality, where honesty and openness could coexist with competence and resilience. There was fear in this admission, but also an unmistakable sense of liberation. The recognition that she no longer had to survive alone, that support, empathy, and self-compassion could exist alongside the fortitude that had defined her for decades. And yet, the story did not end with confession. Jane's legacy, now reframed by honesty, held an open-ended question. Could survival evolve into living fully, beyond the constraints of myth and expectation? Could a woman who had been unbreakable in the eyes of the world also allow herself to be fragile and human, without consequence? The wind howled through the trees outside, carrying with it the echo of years of silence finally broken. The cabin, warm and illuminated by firelight, felt simultaneously intimate and infinite, a space where endings and beginnings intertwined. Jane Kilcher had finally confirmed the truth, but the journey she had long deferred was only beginning. In acknowledging her own humanity, she opened the door to healing, transformation, and purpose beyond mere survival. The silence that had once oppressed her was replaced by the possibility of connection, understanding, and a life where strength could coexist with vulnerability. The cameras captured her words, but more importantly, they captured her freedom. The first breath of a life reclaimed, and a story far from over.